Good afternoon, and thank you for watching this lecture recital, in which I will discuss Barbara York's piece for solo tuba, 4 Paintings by Grant Wood. In 2012, York received a commission from Associate Professor John Manning of the University of Iowa to write a work for solo tuba. Professor Manning requested that the work would be based on 4 paintings by native Iowan painter Grant Wood. The 4 paintings that he requested are Stone City, Iowa, Young Corn, American Gothic, and Parson Weems' Fable. Barbara York transformed each painting into a distinct movement and was inspired by the artist's personal life, in addition to specific details from the paintings to compose this piece of music. This lecture recital will focus on these details of the work and will culminate in a performance as a demonstration of the compositional details. Barbara York was born in Winnipeg, Canada in 1949. York attended McGill University in Quebec, Canada during the 1960s, but encountered difficulties in college because she strongly disliked the prevalent musical aesthetic of universities during that time. In a news interview by the Joplin Globe, York explains that what was considered acceptable in universities at that point was atonal music. That was the big rage. If you didn't write atonal music, you weren't considered appropriate. In spite of these challenges which she faced during her university studies and early in her career, Barbara York has encountered much success as a composer. Her score and lyrics for Colette won the Dora Maver Moore Award in 1981, which is Canada's version of a Tony. Her first tuba piece, Sea Dreams, was composed for Mike Fisher in 2002. 4 years after writing Sea Dreams, York won the Harvey Phillips Award for Euphonium in Chamber Music at the International Tuba and Euphonium Conference with her piece Conversations for euphonium, alto saxophone, and piano. Barbara York has become quite reputable among the tuba and euphonium community, exemplified in both her substantial compositional output and attention from noteworthy professionals. Her compositions have been included on the Leonard Falcone International Euphonium and Tuba Festival Solo Competition required repertoire list for 4 out of the previous 5 years. Also, Tim Busby and the Iceland Symphony recorded her Concerto for Tuba and Orchestra on Busby's CD, Raw Emotions. York's career has also consisted of work as a concert accompanist for over 45 years, but she recently has retired from accompanying. Although York's health is unfortunately declining, she continues to compose new works. The most recent is her Nautical Myths and Legends for solo tuba and piano. Barbara York became an American citizen in 2017 and currently lives in Pittsburgh, Kansas. In order to better understand the paintings, and therefore York's 4 paintings by Grant Wood, I believe that it is essential to have a knowledge of Grant Wood and his personal struggles, because his internal and external struggles greatly influenced his art. To achieve an understanding of Grant Wood, Barbara York studied Grant Wood, A Life by R. Tripp Evans, among other biographies. However, she explained that she was the most inspired by R. Tripp Evans' book. Grant Wood was born on February 13th, 1891, in a rural town of Anamosa, Iowa, on a farmhouse. Wood's father, Francis Merville Wood, known as Merville, had a great reputation in his community as an honest, hardworking man who was known for his masculine religion that was not disgraced by the feminine sentimentality that was discouraged during the late 19th century. Wood's complex relationship, or lack thereof, with his father is evidenced in 2 of the 4 paintings in York's 4 paintings by Grant Wood. Those are American Gothic and Parson Weems' Fable. In Wood's incomplete autobiography, he writes about his father. There was a certain mystery and loneliness about father that I sensed even as a child, a strange quality of detachment which no one would ever be able to understand. He continues, we loved him and revered him, yet we sensed that he was not one of us. Wood, however, crossed out sensed and replaced it with knew. Grant Wood knew that his father was not one of them. Wood's relationship with his mother, Hattie Weaver Wood, was in stark contrast to that of his father. He experienced comfort, love, and support from his mother. Although Merville excluded Grant from helping with the farm because he was weak, Hattie had him help with gardening and taught him the names of all the flowers and plants. More so than farming, these experiences inspired Wood's admiration for Iowan landscapes. Grant Wood's support from his mother was also exemplified by his first art studio. To escape his father's disapproval, young Wood hid under the kitchen table to draw. He would begin only after Merville left for the fields. Grant Wood explained that he had privacy and could peer out at the world through the arched openings in the red checkerboard tablecloth. This arched theme became an archetype for Wood, as arches and curtains are on display in many of his paintings, such as in Parson Weems' Fable, which is the fourth movement of this piece. Another important figure in Grant Wood's personal life was his sister, Nan Wood. Although he had two older brothers, he was the closest to Nan. Following the death of his father in 1901, Grant, Nan, and Hattie grew much closer and solidified a bond that persisted throughout their entire lives. Wood's family can be observed in several of Wood's paintings, either as models, subjects, or muses. For example, the small figures in Young Corn are reminiscent of Grant and Nan Wood playing in the fields during their childhood. Wood evokes both the memory of his father and mother in Parson Weems' Fable. His relationship with Merville can be seen in the work's foreground, in the confrontation between father and son. The background of the work includes a harmonious cooperation between mother and son, which is reminiscent of Wood's relationship with his own mother. For each movement of 4 paintings by Grant Wood, Barbara York focused on specific aspects of the corresponding paintings. Rather than writing music that broadly described the paintings, York includes her own perspective of Grant Wood's works. In order to achieve a well-informed performance of this piece, I interviewed Barbara York about which details from the paintings and from Wood's life inspired her writing. The composition begins with the movement, Stone City, Iowa. The painting consists of an Iowan landscape in a small city, Stone City. A bustling town in the late 19th century, Stone City had practically become a ghost town when the painting was completed. A ghost town in which Grant Wood enjoyed visiting to work on his sketches. There is one primary detail of the painting which York focuses on in this first movement, the horse traveling through the scenery. The soft motor rhythm which introduces the piece is meant to depict the horse and rider entering the scene. York explained in an interview, it's a little bit Schubert in terms of accompaniment. It's a little bit like Schubert's art songs when you get this pattern going, the riding pattern. The particular art song which she references is Schubert's Erl King, which begins similarly with the moving rhythm in the accompaniment. Ironically, Erl King is about a boy and a loving father, whereas Grant Wood's relationship with his own father was very antithetical to that. York explains that this irony is coincidental but interesting nonetheless. The tuba solo enters 4 bars after the piano with an acrobatic melody that seems to grow out of the accompaniment. York uses dynamic swells throughout the movement, such as the crescendo in measure 21, followed by the decrescendo in measure 22, to portray the rolling hills of the Iowan landscapes found in Stone City, Iowa. The listener follows the horse and rider's journey through Wood's scenery as the movement progresses. Beginning in measure 31, York represents passing objects that are zipping by the horse and rider. The accented notes that come through the texture are meant to capture this zipping sensation of passing trees, buildings, and other objects in the horse's path. According to York, her interpretation is that Grant Wood is the horse rider and wants to return or ride to the safety and comfort of his childhood farm. R. Tripp Evans suggests the childlike qualities of Stone City, Iowa, in Wood's invitation for viewers to slide down Stone City's velvety hills, peek into its doll-sized houses, and skate across the mirrored surface of a turquoise-blue Wassipinicon River. These innocent features reinforces Barbara's interpretation of the rider, Grant Wood, longing to ride back to the comfort of his childhood. The melody in measures 41 through 52 is meant to evoke a longing, a desire to go back to his childhood. Beginning at measure 69 is another section of objects zipping by the rider, followed by a reprise of the opening theme at measure 77. The music of the final 11 measures is meant to suggest the exit of the horse and rider. The motor rhythms slow down, and York includes both a ritardando and a decrescendo to niente. The primary performance considerations of Stone City, Iowa include the wide acrobatic leaps and endurance issues. Measures 21 through 22 and 31 through 32, which I showed previously, are 2 examples of sections with agile intervals. These wide leaps are more difficult because they often occur in the upper register of the instrument. This causes issues due to the close partials in this register. The movement is challenging in regards to endurance because in the 119 measures, the soloist rests only 3 times for more than a measure. 2 of these rest periods are 2 measures, and the third is 4 measures. At the quicker tempo, these rest periods go by quickly. The endurance concerns are compounded by the high tessitura of the movement. John Manning selected the 4 paintings for Barbara York to use in this composition, but he did not specify the order. York informed me that she sequenced the paintings in a way that made the most sense to her, and that she took some artistic liberty in the connection between movements. As previously mentioned, the primary subject of the first movement was the horse riding through the scenery. York envisioned the second movement, Young Corn, as the rider's destination, the subject of his yearning, his childhood farm. Young Corn is another example of one of Grant Wood's Iowan landscapes. There are vast hills, a farm, fields of corn, and 3 people in the field. Barbara York explained that the little kids in this huge landscape, she continues, that's him and his sister. He goes home, but those children aren't there anymore. That's his memory. He could get back to the farm, but you can't get back to your childhood. So it's a memory rather than a reality. Although Grant Wood could not return to his childhood, York wrote this movement to suggest the safety and peacefulness that one might feel when reminiscing over childhood. The opening melody conveys a general sense of longing. However, in measure 19, Barbara York mentions specific playful childhood memories that Grant Wood might be reminiscing over. She mentioned that the protagonist of this movement during the section might be asking the audience, "Remember when we used to run around and play together and throw water at each other and chase the chicken?" She composed this section to sound playful and recollective. After this playful section, York writes poco movendo, and the music gradually ascends into the upper register, which leads to the poco più agitato in conjunction with the F-sharp 4. York explains that this is a cry of longing after remembering how special and safe his childhood was. She continued to say, "It's like, and then you let it out and bring it down." After this high point, the dynamic and the register descends to the tempo primo with the recurrence of the opening theme at measure 43. York confirmed my inquiry that the climax of this movement, which occurs at measure 35, is a longing that cries out and then settles. But you are still longing. And then it's back at the beginning. It's like a cycle of longing. Compared to the first movement, Young Corn is not as technically acrobatic, but is challenging in different ways. While Stone City, Iowa is physically taxing, Young Corn is more emotionally taxing. The tubist must stay engaged in the emotion of the movement for the entire duration. Other than this emotional aspect, the movement also presents challenges in the high tessitura, wide intervals, and an instance in which the soloist must enter on an F-sharp 4 after 1 beat of rest. The peaceful sense of longing is abruptly interrupted by the tritone, which occurs between measures 63 and 64. The short melody of measure 61 that resolves from D to E is repeated in measure 63. However, the D to A flat produces a feeling of discomfort, which foreshadows the anxiety of the third movement. The third movement is based on one of the most recognized pieces in the history of American art, the painting with the pitchfork, more formally known as American Gothic. In the present day, the painting is viewed much differently than the original reception. This painting debuted at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1930 and was the university-acknowledged hit of the show. In Grant Wood's biography by R. Tripp Evans, the author attributes this positive reception by art critics to the painting's powerful psychological charge. The reaction by rural Iowans, however, was contrasted to that of the urban art critics. Many native Iowans were angered by this image, perceiving it in parody as cruel as it was inaccurate. The Iowans felt that they were being misrepresented in American Gothic. This disapproval by the people Wood grew up around and loved caused a great deal of anxiety for him. In composing the third movement, American Gothic, Barbara York explained that most people know of this painting. Therefore, her aim was not to portray Wood's painting through her writing, but to represent reactions to the painting, as well as Grant Wood's emotional response to these reactions. In representing Wood's emotional response, York also seeks to capture the complexity of Wood's relationship with Iowa in this movement. In doing so, she includes three primary motives which represent specific elements of this complex relationship with respect to the reception of American Gothic. York explains that these motives, which I will discuss in greater detail, represent anxiety and fear for the people's reactions, an anguished longing to escape to the simplicity of childhood from the complexity of adulthood, and the militaristic marching of these people to protest. The opening and the piano accompaniment is meant to suggest alarm bells because of the uproar Grant Wood created when he debuted American Gothic. To achieve this sense of alarm, York writes dissonant major seconds and heavy accented offbeats. This accompaniment sets the stage for the entry of the tuba solo, which begins in measure 3 with the first motive, the anxiety-fear motive. York explains that this anxiety is rather complex in Grant Wood's feelings towards his native land and the people that live there. She explains that the question can be asked about this movement. Did he like Iowans, or did he find them harsh and judgmental? To which she said that both were valid, based on her interpretation. It might be beneficial to expound upon this duality by highlighting a few relevant aspects of Grant Wood's personal life. Wood never openly professed to be a homosexual, as doing so in the early 20th century would have more than likely ruined his reputation. However, many people who were close to Grant Wood, including several of his students, claimed that everybody thought he was. Although Grant Wood loved much about Iowa, including the scenery, rural life, and nature, he never felt completely accepted by Iowans, except by his mother, sister, and some of his close friends. Barbara York explained that she included these internal struggles in composing this movement. The opening motive consists of an altered recurrence of a melody from the second movement. The opening melody of movement 2, which can be found in measure 3, is slightly transformed in the third movement. The melody that can be found in measure 5 of the third movement is placed at the end of the anxiety motive, transcribed down a third, and the final note is lowered a half step. This creates a tritone from the first note to the last note. York explains that the melody of the second movement is a positive longing. It's nostalgic. However, she continues to explain that one might feel that you can't be nostalgic anymore in American Gothic because of the danger. The nostalgia is gone. After presenting the anxiety motive in various keys and registers, York introduces a motive in measure 27, which is meant to suggest a longing for the comfort of childhood. She explains that in this motive, on one hand, he is missing his childhood roots. On the other, he has been attacked by the very people he loves, and he also now sees them as three-dimensional. It's almost like, tell me that my childhood was real, that these people were genuine, that I can get back there, but I know I can't. I suggested to Barbara York that I conceptualize the words over and over when playing this section, to which she responded that this conceptualization fits the melody well. The third significant motive of American Gothic occurs for the first time in measure 53 of the accompaniment. This triplet rhythm is meant to depict a militaristic marching of the Iowans to protest Grant Wood's painting. Therefore, I will refer to this motive as the militaristic motive. There is a notable interchange between the accompaniment and the soloist during this section. The accompaniment presents this militaristic motive in alteration with the soloist playing the anxiety motive from the beginning of the movement, although it's transposed up a fourth. This suggests a juxtaposition of the militaristic Iowans and the anxiety that Grant Wood felt towards them. Following this interplay, the soloist in measure 69 begins at a mezzo forte and increases dynamically for 7 measures until, at this point, the interchange is reversed so that the accompaniment is playing the anxiety motive and the soloist is now playing the militaristic motive. Another recurrence worth mentioning is the much more subtle offbeat accompaniment in measure 86, which recalls the alarm of the movement's opening. This accompaniment has a much thicker texture, and the dissonance is not as sharp. The opening alarm accompaniment consisted of two pitches, E and D. This section in measure 86 consists of mostly minor chords over a C pedal in the left hand. Rather than the anxiety motive played by the soloist in conjunction with the alarm accompaniment at the beginning, the soloist plays the longing motive in measure 86. The various occurrences of the motives at different places in the movement highlight the complexity of emotions that Grant Wood experienced in the wake of American Gothic's reception. In the only cadenza of the work, Barbara York combines all of the previously heard motives to summarize Grant Wood's emotions about this conflicted reception. York describes this cadenza as a cry of anguish about the treatment he received, partly because he can't go back to the safety of his childhood. In the opening of this cadenza, the audience will hear the quick 16th note passage that was previously presented in measures 12 through 15. York explained that this melody is another way which Grant Wood expresses his anxiety and fear. The melody is an extension of the anxiety motive. The rest of the cadenza expands upon the longing motive and the militaristic motive. The longing motive is sequenced in the third phrase of the cadenza, where the final three notes are repeated an octave higher and then another octave higher. This repetition fits the conceptualization that I mentioned to Barbara well, over and over, and over, and over. After this sequence, the soloist seems to unwind the militaristic motive. The melody is sped up, slowed down, and then becomes a version of the motive from the beginning of the second movement. As I mentioned previously, the four-note melody at the end of the anxiety motive is a transformation of the melody from movement 2. The end of the cadenza is not the minor ending of the anxiety motive, but the major reminiscent version from the second movement, which is interesting because it occurs after the slowing down of the militaristic motive. This seems to suggest that this slowing down of the militaristic motive represents either the recession of the protesters or Grant Wood coming to terms with the fact that Iowans did not like this painting. Although York explained that when she wrote this, she wrote it in a way that combined all of the previously heard motives rather than with specific programmatic elements. Performance challenges of the third movement are not as pronounced as those of previous movements. For most of American Gothic, the tessitura is in the middle register, E2 to G3, but the soloist plays multiple passages above the staff throughout. This relatively lower tessitura is a relief from the frequent upper register playing of the first two movements. In measure 18, the soloist must enter on an E4 after two measures of rest. This is not quite as challenging as the entry of the F-sharp 4 in the previous movement because of the E pedal in the left hand of the accompaniment during the entrance in movement 3. The primary performance consideration of the cadenza is how to manipulate the tempo in a way to best communicate the cry of anguish that should be evoked during this section. The third movement segues into the fourth, Parson Weems' Fable. Barbara York explains that this movement is based off of Grant Wood's thoughts about a historical fable as seen in his painting. Rather than composing in a way that inserts Grant Wood into this painting, which is valid based on R. Tripp Evans' description of the work, York instead focuses on Wood's depiction of this historical fable. Parson Weems' Fable, the painting, was a depiction of the famous yet inaccurate story of George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree. This fable originated from Washington's first posthumous biographer, Mason Locke Weems, also known as Parson Weems. This painting is particularly unnatural in Grant Wood's use of a famous portrait of George Washington, who was 64 years old when it was painting, on the body of young George in Parson Weems' Fable. The portrait of George Washington, known as the Athenaeum portrait, was originally painted in 1796 by Gilbert Stuart. In Wood's painting, he is, in a way, poking fun at the fallacy of the fable that was created by Parson Weems. The peculiar use of Washington's adult head on the depiction of young George draws attention to how equally imprecise it would be to assume that George Washington, the presidential, honest man who could never tell a lie, was always so, even as a young boy. To further express the irony of the fable, Grant Wood includes two slaves in the background of the work. In order to communicate Grant Wood's feelings towards this fable, Barbara York uses a dramatic device, melodrama, which is prevalent throughout this entire fourth movement. The work begins with a musical quote from Hail to the Chief, which was first played on February 22nd, 1815, to honor the late George Washington and the end of the War of 1812. Barbara York uses this quote to set the stage for the Allegro Furioso in measure 6 and the melodramatic entry of the soloist 2 measures later. York explained that the motives do not suggest any specific idea. However, the entire section from measure 6 until 27 is meant to portray George Washington's father in the painting and his reaction to his son chopping down his cherry tree. This section is grandiose in a melodramatic fashion, and after ending in a perfect authentic cadence at measure 25, transitions to the dolce and legato section. York explains that this slower section represents young George Washington's exaggerated apology to his father for chopping down the cherry tree. The melody is lyrical, also melodramatic, and can be felt in 2. After young George Washington's apology to his father, the accompaniment reintroduces the father with a recurrence of the Hail to the Chief quote, followed by a recapitulation of the opening melody. Rather than an exact repetition of the opening, Barbara York replaces the second half with new material, beginning at measure 59. This section is marked joyfully, slightly faster, and it's in A major, which is the parallel major to the rest of the fourth movement. York explains that this section represents the joy and pride that George Washington's father felt because of his son's apology. It is also grandiose and melodramatic. When explaining the melodramatic aspect of this movement, Barbara York mimicked silent movie film actors and their overstated movements. At the end of the piece, York extends another authentic cadence in the accompaniment, which begins on the E dominant 7th chord in beat 3 of measure 88, and then she inserts 3 repetitions of Hail to the Chief prior to the resolution to the tonic in the final 3 measures. Not only does this final section function as a representation of the Father's joy, it also acts as a grand finale to the entire work. The performance considerations of the fourth movement are similar to those of previous movements. The primary challenges of this movement include the use of the extreme upper register, issues of clarity on the quicker rhythms at the faster tempo, and a consideration of the intended musical style. The upper register is most on display in the dolce and legato section. The highest note of the entire work, G4, is played in measure 42 and is approached by a small leap. Though the movement does not stay in the upper register throughout, this dolce and legato section presents endurance challenges after the previous 10 to 15 minutes of physically taxing playing. The 16th note that follows the dotted 8th in measure 9 should be played with precision and clarity. As I have mentioned previously, this movement is very melodramatic. It would be important then to consider this style in every section of Parson Weems' fable, because the whole movement would be misrepresented without dramatic phrasing. As one might quickly deduce from an investigation of this piece, Barbara York completed extensive background research about Grant Wood and the 4 paintings that John Manning requested that the work would be based on. York used the information that she gained from this research, combined with her own insight and her humanity, to create this work. Aside from the artistic details that influenced York's compositional decisions, this work stands alone as an interesting piece of music. However, when supplemented with, at minimum, a visual of the paintings, the performance and reception of this work is greatly enhanced. Ideally, one would study the intricacies of the painting and would follow a similar line of research as Barbara York in the preparation of this piece to create a well-informed performance. I would now like to take a 5-minute intermission and then invite my collaborative pianist, Allison Post, to join me on stage to perform Barbara York's 4 paintings by Grant Wood. The performance will be augmented with the display of the paintings by which each movement was influenced. Thank you.